It had been gray when it was new, years ago, in another life. Now it was the gray of ash, of apology, of things quietly set aside. The beaded hem Stephanie had accidentally torn in the carriage still caught the light in places, little sparks of what it had been, scattered across the fraying silk like a broken constellation. She had learned to hold her spine straight. Showing pain, she knew from long practice, was an invitation. Stephanie commanded the room's center like she had been born to it, which, in every way that the pack counted, she had. Her gown was the deep amber of winter honey, the fabric alone worth more than Jessica's monthly allowance. Every movement she made was a small, calculated theater, the tilt of a perfect chin, the drift of a hand that wore 3 rings. Around her, the sons of high-ranking wolves laughed too eagerly, and the daughters of alpha families watched with carefully concealed envy, the second most sincere form of flattery. "You should be grateful I brought you at all," Stephanie had murmured in the carriage, her voice pitched low enough to feel like a confidence, sharp enough to function as a blade. "You aren't a guest, Jessica. You're a backdrop. You make everything around you look better simply by contrast." She had smiled then, the smile that only Jessica knew was not a smile. Jessica had kept her eyes on the dark road through the carriage window and said nothing. She was good at that. Years of practice. I know you are already enjoying this video. Please hit the subscribe button and don't also forget to tell us where you are watching from. She felt the shift before she saw its cause. The air changed, the way air changes before a storm breaks, when the pressure drops and every animal instinct fires at once. The scent hit her first, ozone and old pine and something older still. Something that bypassed thought and landed directly in the oldest part of her blood. Beside her, even the stone pillar seemed to lean away. The music didn't stop. It simply faltered, a half-beat of hesitation from the string section, one violinist's bow going still, one note swallowed before it could be born. Then the crowd moved. Not toward the door. Away from it. The parting was unconscious, collective, animal, the involuntary deference of every wolf in the room to a predator their bodies recognized before their minds could. Marcel Gottschalk entered without announcement. He did not need one. He wore a crown of hammered gold set with dark stones, but it was not the crown that commanded the room. It was the stillness at his center, the absolute, terrifying calm of a man who has never once doubted his own authority and never needed to. He was broad across the shoulder, dark-suited, unhurried, his gaze moving through the crowd the way a blade moves through water, cleanly, without resistance, and leaving everything changed in its wake. Stephanie's hand rose instinctively to her throat. Her smile recalibrated. Jessica watched her sister's entire body rearrange itself, posture, expression, the precise angle of her collarbone, into the optimal configuration for being chosen. Jessica looked away. She pressed her back against the pillar and stared at a point somewhere near the floor. At the frayed hem of her dress where 3 beads had come loose, and told herself, as she had told herself every humiliation before this, survive the night. Just survive the night. She did not notice that his footsteps had stopped. She noticed only the quiet. The particular, impossible quiet of a room full of people who have all, at the same moment, forgotten to breathe. And then the warmth. A warmth that had nothing to do with the chandeliers, closer, deliberate, radiating from a direction that made no sense, from the direction of the only person in the room who could silence it simply by choosing where to stand. Jessica raised her eyes. Marcel Gottschalk, Alpha King of 4 territories, was looking at her. Not past her. Not through her. At her. With the complete, undistracted focus of a man who has found exactly what he came for, and has been looking for a very long time. Something old and unnameable moved through her blood like a tide coming in. Doors opened, and the world inside the ballroom changed its mind about itself. It happened in layers. First the candle flames, every one of them leaning, as though a wind had passed through a room with no windows. Then the wolves themselves, the high-blooded, the titled, the carefully composed, spines straightening, chins dropping by degrees, bodies obeying something older than manners and deeper than choice. The Alpha Command did not announce itself. It simply arrived, the way gravity arrives, quietly, completely, with no interest in being refused. Marcel Gottschalk crossed the threshold without breaking his stride. He was taller than Jessica had understood a man could be in a room full of tall men. Dark suit, no adornment but the crown, and even the crown seemed incidental, a formality his presence had long outgrown. His eyes moved through the ballroom the way a general reads a field, not with urgency, but with the particular patience of someone who has already decided the outcome. Around him, a radius of held breath expanded like a stone dropped in still water. Jessica pressed herself flatter against the pillar and looked at the floor. She was practiced at disappearing. She had been doing it her whole life. And then something peculiar happened to her blood. Not pain, nothing so clean as pain. A warmth, low and steady, moving up through her sternum like an ember catching. She had felt cold for so long, cold in ways that had nothing to do with temperature, that the sensation confused her before it frightened her. She pressed a hand to her ribs, half expecting to find something wrong. Instead she found only her own heartbeat, which had changed its rhythm to something slower. Calmer. As though some part of her, the part that lived beneath thought, beneath pride, beneath all of Stephanie's carefully administered damage, had recognized something in the room and gone profoundly, inexplicably still. Not the stillness of fear. The stillness of something long lost catching, at last, the scent of home. Across the room, Stephanie laughed at something a baron's son had said, her voice carrying its usual bright, sharpened music. She had not looked at Jessica in 20 minutes. She had already forgotten her. This was the natural order, the gold forgetting the dust the moment the ballroom door closed behind them. The footsteps grew closer. Jessica did not look up. She counted the fraying beads on her hem instead, 1, 2, 3, a discipline she had used before, in worse rooms than this. The warmth in her chest deepened to something almost unbearable, and still she did not look up, because whatever was happening to her could not possibly be meant for her. The footsteps stopped. The ballroom stopped with them. Stephanie found her, as Stephanie always did, with the precision of someone who had spent years mapping the exact coordinates of Jessica's hiding places. Her fingers closed around Jessica's wrist before Jessica had fully registered her approach, a grip that looked, to any observer, like a sisterly touch. It was not. It was the grip of a woman who understood that the most elegant cruelties were the ones that resembled affection. There you are, Stephanie murmured, her smile already assembled and aimed outward, at the two young men drifting toward them from the refreshment table. I've been looking everywhere for you. She had not been looking for Jessica at all. Jessica was a prop she had just decided to use. She positioned them side by side with the practiced ease of someone arranging a still life, herself in the amber silk, Jessica in the gray ruin, the contrast so stark it required no commentary. But Stephanie provided commentary anyway. She always did. You'll have to forgive my sister, she said to the taller of the two men, her voice warm with false apology. She insisted on coming, though I did try to warn her the occasion called for something a little more considered. Her gaze traveled down Jessica's dress and back up, a slow, surgical journey that left nothing intact. Jessica felt the old machinery engage inside her, the familiar lowering of the shoulders, the softening of the face into blankness, the retreat behind her own eyes to a place Stephanie's words could not fully reach. She had built that place brick by brick over many years. It was the only property she owned. The men laughed. Not cruelly, they were not cruel men, merely careless ones, which amounted, in Jessica's experience, to the same wound by a different instrument. One of them glanced at her the way a person glances at furniture, registering presence, categorizing it as irrelevant, moving on. The other did not glance at her at all. She has her charms, Stephanie continued, tilting her head in a performance of generosity. In the right light. At the right distance. She laughed at her own joke, a sound like crystal being struck, beautiful, and faintly dangerous. Jessica said nothing. She stood straight. She always stood straight. And then the warmth returned. It moved through her without warning, the same deep, inexplicable current from before, low in the chest, rising. Her breath caught on it. Beside her, Stephanie continued talking, continued performing, continued sharpening herself against Jessica's silence like a blade against stone. But the warmth did not care about Stephanie. It was not interested in any of that. It was coming from across the room. From a specific point in the room. From a direction that, if she turned, which she would not, which she could not, would show her a man in a crown who had stopped walking. Who had not yet looked away. He moved, and the ballroom moved around him. There was no command spoken, no gesture made. Marcel Gottschalk simply shifted his weight from stillness into motion, and the crowd responded the way iron filings respond to a passing magnet, drawn aside, reordered, rearranged along invisible lines of force without any of them quite understanding why they had stepped back. Conversations dissolved mid-sentence. Champagne coupes were lowered, forgotten. A path opened through the heart of the ballroom, and it opened for him, and everyone who made way told themselves it was their own idea. It was not their own idea. The calculation began immediately. Jessica could feel it rippling outward through the room like a secondary current beneath the first. Heads turned toward Stephanie. Eyes assessed, compared, triangulated. The conclusion was obvious to all of them. Who else could a king be walking toward? Stephanie Maurer was the finest offering the room held. Bloodline impeccable, beauty engineered, every detail of her appearance a considered argument for her own worthiness. She was exactly the kind of woman a man like Marcel was supposed to want, and the room had already decided this story's ending before it had been written. Stephanie knew it too. Jessica felt the shift in her sister's posture before she saw it, that infinitesimal straightening, the chin lifted 2 degrees, the smile recalibrated from bright to radiant, from performance to invitation. A lifetime of preparation, arriving at its intended moment. She was magnificent at it. Jessica could admit that, in the sealed room behind her ribs where she stored only true things. The footsteps were steady, unhurried, each one landing like a word in a sentence whose meaning Jessica could not yet read. She was still looking at the floor. She had decided, firmly, that she would continue looking to the floor. Whatever was happening in this room was not happening to her, it was happening near her, the way storms happen near trees that were not struck, only shaken. She was very good at being the tree that was not struck. She had years of practice at that too. The warmth in her chest had become something closer to sound, a low, resonant hum beneath the range of hearing, vibrating in her teeth, in the thin bones behind her ears. She pressed her molars together. She breathed through her nose. She counted the same 3 loose beads on her hem she had counted before, their edges familiar as worry stones worn smooth. Around her, she felt Stephanie gather herself, the full, magnificent, weapon-bright gathering of a woman who has waited her entire life for exactly this moment and intends to deserve it. The footsteps did not slow. They did not turn. They grew closer. The first thing to go was the music. Not all at once, it unraveled from the outside in, the way a fire dies at its edges before its center surrenders. The cellos dropped first, then the violins, one by one losing their nerve, until the final note hung alone in the gilded air for one long, bewildered moment before it too gave up and let the silence have the room. The silence that followed was not empty. It was the most crowded silence Jessica had ever stood inside, packed dense with the held breath of 200 wolves who had all, simultaneously, understood that something was happening that had not been on the evening's program. Marcel Gottschalk was standing in front of Jessica Engel. Not beside her. Not near her. In front of her, with the full, unhurried, deliberate intention of a man who had decided exactly where he meant to be and saw no reason to explain himself to a room. The crowd that had parted so eagerly for his passage now stood frozen along its edges, recalculating, finding that none of their calculations resolved into anything that made sense. Jessica felt the stares before she felt anything else, 100 gazes landing on her like a change in atmospheric pressure, some sharp with confusion, some with something uglier. She understood, in the peculiar clarity that arrives inside catastrophe, that she was the most visible person in the room. She, who had spent every year of her life perfecting invisibility. She, in the gray dress. She, the dust. She did not look at Stephanie. She could not afford to. But she felt her sister beside her the way one feels a fire cooling, that sudden, particular withdrawal of warmth that is somehow colder than cold weather. The amber silk stopped moving. The rehearsed radiance, the carefully tilted chin, the smile that had been assembled with such architectural precision for exactly this moment, all of it met the reality of Marcel's stillness and began, incrementally, to understand that it had been built for a door that was not going to open. The smile did not fall. Stephanie was too practiced for that. It simply stopped being true. The warmth drained from it the way color drains from a face, slowly, then all at once, leaving behind the precise shape of a smile with nothing alive inside it. A portrait of the expression rather than the expression itself. Jessica had never seen her sister's face do that before. She had never had occasion to. Marcel had still not looked away from Jessica. He had not looked at Stephanie at all, not in acknowledgement, not in dismissal, not in the polite, apologetic sideways glance that might have softened the verdict. He looked at Jessica the way one looks at the only true thing in a room full of beautiful imitations, with the focused, quiet certainty of a man who no longer has any use for the imitations. Somewhere to the left, a woman whispered something to her companion. Somewhere to the right, a man cleared his throat and looked at the floor. And in the amber silk, in the ruins of a smile, Stephanie Maurer began, finally, irreversibly, to understand that the evening was not going to end the way she had written it. He stopped before her, and the world, with a kind of stunned, collective shame, stopped with him. Jessica felt it before she understood it, the warmth arriving all at once, no longer a current beneath the surface but a tide, full and undeniable, breaking over the careful architecture she had spent years building between herself and feeling. The hum in her blood became a roar, became a silence so absolute it swallowed every chandelier, every orchestra, every breath Stephanie had not yet taken, and then it was only this. Only him. Only the fact of him standing close enough that she could see the dark stones in his crown catching the candlelight like captured stars. She made herself look up. His eyes were the color of deep water in winter, gray-green, still, fathomless, and they were looking at her with an expression she did not have a word for, had never needed a word for, because no one had ever looked at her this way before. Not through her. Not past her. Not at the torn hem or the frayed sleeves or the careful blankness she wore like armor. He was looking at the place behind all of that. The sealed room. The only property she owned. As though he had always known the address. His hand rose, slowly, with a deliberateness that made it feel like a declaration, and curved against her jaw. The touch was devastating in its gentleness. A hand that could have bent iron, that carried in its breadth and its stillness the entire accumulated authority of 4 territories and an unbroken bloodline. That hand cradled her face the way one cradles something that has been lost for a very long time and found, at last, against all reasonable expectation. His thumb moved once, the barest fraction, across the line of her cheekbone. As though confirming she was real. As though he needed the confirmation. The mate bond did not arrive like lightning, the way the old stories promised. It arrived like the moment a key finds its lock, a small, precise, irrevocable click deep in the center of her, and then every door she had ever shut swung open. Simultaneously, and light came flooding into rooms that had been dark for so long they had forgotten they were rooms at all. Every wound Stephanie had administered, every year of practiced invisibility, every bead she had ever counted on a fraying hem to keep herself from breaking, all of it illuminated, and somehow, in the illumination, made smaller. Made survivable. Made, against every available evidence, into something that had been worth enduring. She was shaking. She discovered this the way one discovers weather, not when it begins, but when it has already been happening for some time. His hand steadied her. He did not speak. He did not need to. His eyes said what his voice had not yet offered, I see you. I have always been moving toward you. You were never dust. You were never shadow. Behind them, a champagne coupe slipped from fingers gone suddenly nerveless. It shattered on the marble floor. Neither of them heard it. He had not spoken since entering the room. The silence around him had been so complete, so long, and so full of its own authority, that when he finally did speak, the ballroom had forgotten that voices existed at all. His hand was still curved against Jessica's jaw. His eyes had not left her face. When he turned, just slightly, just enough, to address the room, it was not the turn of a man who requires an audience. It was the turn of a man who intends to be understood, and understands the difference. She is mine. She has always been mine. And every slight ever paid to her has been paid against a queen. 3 sentences. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The alpha command threaded through each word like iron through silk, carrying it into the furthest corners of the ballroom, pressing it into the bones of everyone present with the quiet, irresistible insistence of something that is not a request and has never considered becoming one. The chandeliers did not shake. The floor did not crack. Nothing so theatrical. The room simply received the words the way stone receives an engraving, permanently, without negotiation, changed in its fundamental structure from that moment forward. Jessica felt them land inside her like that. Like an engraving. Like something being made permanent that she had never dared allow herself to want, not the claiming, not the crown implicit in his words, but the smaller, older, more essential thing buried beneath all of it, the fact of being defended. Of having someone stand between her and the wind, not because she could not stand alone, she had stood alone her entire life, but because she no longer had to. She was shaking again. She did not try to stop it this time. The room did not recover. It attempted recovery, the involuntary social machinery of 200 wolves reaching for normalcy the way a drowning person reaches for anything solid, but the words had rearranged the architecture of the evening and nothing could be placed back where it had stood before. Whispers moved along the crowd's edges like fire along a fuse, each one feeding the next. His mate, the Engel girl, that dress, did you hear him, a queen, and underneath all of them, the one no one said aloud but everyone thought, she was here the whole time. Marcel turned back to Jessica. Only to Jessica. His thumb moved again against her cheekbone, that same small, certain motion, the confirmation that she was real, and something in his expression shifted from declaration into something quieter and more private, something the room had not been invited to witness but was witnessing anyway. Tenderness. From a man the 4 territories feared. Directed at the girl in the gray dress. Unconcealed, unapologetic, immovable as bedrock. To Jessica's left, Stephanie had not moved. She stood exactly where she had stood through all of it, the amber silk, the 3 rings, the extinguished smile, perfectly still, the way things are still when they are no longer sure they know how to move through a world that has just fundamentally changed its mind about them. Stephanie Maurer had never once in her life been invisible. She did not know how to be invisible. She had been constructed, from her earliest understanding of herself, as something that was looked at, and the thing that happened to her now, the thing of being simply not seen, not addressed, not even dismissed but merely excluded from the frame entirely, was a violence she had no language for and no practice surviving. So she did the only thing her architecture permitted. She spoke. My lord. The title came out precisely calibrated, warm without being presumptuous, concerned without being accusatory, the voice of a woman performing reasonableness for an audience she was acutely aware of. I fear there may be some confusion. My sister, Jessica, she is not what she appears. She has no wolf. No bloodline of any standing. Our own pack elders have confirmed it. A breath, delicate as a blade being drawn slowly. She is, I'm sorry to say, a defect. The word landed in the silence like something dropped from a great height. Jessica felt it, the old familiar wound, the one Stephanie had spent years reopening with such practiced efficiency. She felt Marcel's hand, still against her face, go perfectly, dangerously still. He turned then. Slowly. The way tides turn, without hurry, without uncertainty, with the absolute conviction of something that has all of time on its side. He looked at Stephanie for the first time that evening, and what passed across his face was not anger. Anger would have been almost merciful. It was the colder thing, recognition. The look of a man who has been told something he already knew, about a person he had already assessed, and found the assessment precisely as contemptible as he expected. A defect, he repeated. Not a question. The alpha command beneath the words was quiet as groundwater and twice as deep. He let the repetition sit in the room for one long, airless moment. Let every person present here how the word sounded in the mouth of someone who knew what it was worth. She carries the Orin bloodline. The rarest strain in 6 generations. Your pack elders could not read what they were never taught to recognize. The murmur that moved through the crowd was different from the whispers before, lower, older, the sound of people recalibrating not just the evening but years of received certainty. The Orin bloodline. Even those who knew only fragments of the old lore went still at the name, a line so ancient and so rare it existed now only in the histories that packs kept locked and seldom opened. Jessica did not know what the Orin bloodline meant. She had never been told. She had only ever been told what she lacked, never what she carried, because no one who looked at the gray dress and the fraying hem had ever thought to look further. Stephanie's mouth was open. Nothing came out of it. The architecture of her composure, that magnificent, lifelong construction, developed, at last, its first true fracture, not a crack at the edges, not the slow draining of a smile, but a split straight through the foundation, clean and irreparable as ice giving way. Marcel did not watch it happen. He had already turned back to Jessica, back to the only direction. Jessica was beginning to understand, that he intended to face from this night forward. They came to her the way people come to reckonings, slowly at first, then all at once, as though they had been waiting for one another to move first and had finally run out of time. Her father. Her mother. 3 pack elders whose robes had never once been turned in her direction with anything resembling warmth. They arranged themselves before her with the particular posture of people who have not groveled before but have understood, in the last 10 minutes, that they are about to learn how. Marcel had stepped back by a single pace, not away from her, never that, but enough to make clear that what happened next was hers to hold. She felt the deliberateness of it. The gift of it. He was a man who could have spoken for her, could have rendered judgment with 3 words the way he had rendered everything else this evening, and he had chosen instead to leave the room's attention precisely where it belonged. On her. On Jessica. On the girl they had all, in their various ways, decided not to see. Her father's mouth opened first. He was a large man who had always used his size the way Stephanie used her smile, as instrument, as pressure, as a reminder of the space he was entitled to occupy and others were not. He looked smaller now. The ballroom had not shrunk. He had. Jessica. We had no knowledge of the bloodline. The elders confirmed. He stopped. Started again. We only wanted what was best. She had waited her whole life for those words. She had imagined, in the small hours of many difficult nights, that receiving them would feel like something being set down, some long-carried weight finally released from her hands. She waited to feel that now. She felt, instead, the precise and clarifying nothing of understanding that an apology built on new information is not the same as one built on old remorse. They were sorry she was a queen. They had not yet begun to be sorry she was a daughter. Her mother reached for her hand. Jessica looked at the reaching hand, at its rings, its careful tenderness arriving 20 years too late, and made, in the space of one slow breath, the decision that would define every year that followed. She did not take the hand. But she did not step away. I will not collect what is owed to me tonight. Not because the debt is forgiven, but because I intend to decide its terms. When I am ready, and not before. Her voice came out steadier than she had any right to expect, low and clear, with none of the apology she had spent a lifetime reflexively threading into every sentence. It sounded, she realized with a start, like someone who knew their own worth. It sounded like someone who had perhaps always known it, in the sealed room, in the only property she owned, and had simply, at last, been given cause to say so aloud. The elders exchanged a look. Her father closed his mouth. Her mother's hand lowered, slowly, back to her side. Behind her she felt Marcel's presence, steady, unhurried, warm as the bond that hummed between them like a held note, and understood that he would follow her lead in this as in all things. That he had always intended to. The Gottschalk castle did not announce itself the way the ballroom had. It had no need for chandeliers or performance. It rose from the dark hillside in the hour before dawn, massive, unhurried, its towers the color of old iron against a sky that was beginning, at its lowest edge, to remember gold. Jessica looked at it from the carriage window and felt, for the first time in her life, that a place had been waiting for her. Not in the way that rooms are prepared for guests. In the way that some spaces hold a shape long before the thing that belongs in them arrives. She was still wearing the gray dress. She had considered this on the long ride through the dark, that she would arrive at her new life in the same rags she had worn through the worst of the old one, and had found, somewhere past the midpoint of the journey, that she did not mind. The dress was true. Everything she had survived in it was true. She would not begin by pretending otherwise. Marcel was waiting at the castle's entrance, not at the top of the stairs where ceremony would have placed him, but at the bottom, in the cold air, as though he had not been able to remain inside. He was without his crown. Without the ballroom's theater and weight of eyes. He was simply a man standing in the dark, watching a carriage arrive, and something in the plainness of it, the wanting made visible, the authority set aside, undid her more completely than any declaration had. She stepped down without assistance, though he offered his hand, not from pride, but because she needed to know her legs would hold her in this place. They did. She stood on the stones of his courtyard in her fraying hem and looked at him, and he looked back at her, and the bond between them hummed its steady, ancient note in the cold silence. He reached out and took her hand then, both of them still, the castle rising at his back, the first pale thread of dawn unraveling above the tree line, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried none of the alpha command that had restructured a ballroom. It was low. Private. Meant only for the distance between them, which was almost nothing. They counted you out. But you are the only one who ever mattered. You have always been the only count that counted. She did not cry. She had spent too many years spending tears on people who did not earn them to spend them now on joy, which was an extravagance she intended to grow slowly accustomed to. Instead, she tightened her fingers around his, and felt the bond answer, that deep, irrevocable click of recognition, warm and absolute, and let it mean what it meant. Behind them the castle doors stood open, spilling firelight onto the stone. Ahead the dawn was arriving in earnest now, gold pressing up through the dark the way things press upward when they have been held down long enough and finally, find the surface. Jessica Engel, who would soon be Jessica Gottschalk, who had always been Oren, who had been dust and shadow and fraying hem and tattered grace, walked through the door.